Hello, I'm Bill Wagner, and welcome to an introduction to C#. I think C# is a wonderful language, and this is a fine time to learn it. This session is especially designed for beginners or for people who aren't familiar with C# but have done some programming. So we're going to be looking at ways to learn C#, to get used to the language, understand the syntax, experiment with it, learn quite a bit, and play with it. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, this is the opening paragraph from the C# spec. So it just says that C# is a simple, modern, object-oriented, and type-safe language. So a few keys from this. I want you to realize that if you've used C, C++, Java, or JavaScript, learning C# will be relatively easy because the syntax, the structure of it, is going to be similar. All of those languages have very similar structures. The other thing about it is this simple, modern, object-oriented, and type-safe. Those are some of the key tenets of what we're going to do in terms of learning the syntax of the language, understanding its structure, and being able to work with the language throughout anything that you do. Those terms are going to come up over and over again. We're going to talk a little bit about what objects mean. You heard that earlier today with Kathleen and Scott as they were describing different kinds of designs. Type-safe is important in that the compiler, which is what interprets your code and turns it into an executable, understands C# types. So it understands what you're trying to say, and it will tell you if you make mistakes. That simple and modern, that's a lot of what we try to do when we're designing the language, in terms of making it as simple as possible to work with. So it's as simple as possible to get your programs to do what you want them to, rather than interpreting them wrongly and start to make mistakes. And modern, we continue to make investments into the language to keep it modern and to make it easy to build the things that you want to build now. We'll see that more in the second hour that I work with, where I show you what's new in the language. But for right now, this session, I'm assuming you've never seen the language before. So let's get started. Here's a little bit of why I want you to consider C#. This is a list of Stack Overflow's most popular technologies in their 2017 survey. And if you notice, C# is fairly close on that list. We're up there, fourth, among some other very popular languages. On this next slide, this is Stack Overflow's, from the same survey, this is their most loved technologies. And again, C# is on that list. A fair number of people who do work with the language really like working with it. And what that gives us is a community of people who really like the language and a large community. C# is one of only 2 languages that are on both of those lists. And that's our job, to keep that where C# is, and hopefully maybe move it up a little bit on both of those lists. So what I want to do in this hour is give you a reason to start learning the language and some tools to start experimenting and learning the language. And with that, we're going to spend just about the rest of the time playing with the C# language, learning its structure, and getting some of the initial hurdles out of the way, and give you a path to start from you've never seen C# and I want to learn the language, and give you the tools to do that. So I'm going to show you, this is on our doc site, which Scott and Kathleen mentioned. And if you look at the C# guide, one of the things we have right now that we've just added is C# Quick Starts. These are tutorials that you can run in your browser running C# to learn the language. So I'm going to start with this Hello World lesson. And in this session, we're going to run our first program. We're going to do some things to declare and use variables. And let's just go ahead and start here. So when I run my first program, we'll give you some instructions as to what to do. We'll give you an editor over here on the right, and I can go console.writeline. And we'll say hello.net conf. And when I press the run button, what we're going to do is we're going to send that code back to his server. We're going to compile it and run it, and you'll see the output down here at the bottom of our page. So you get to experiment and play with the language. This is live code, live editing. You can do whatever you want. You can add another statement to say Welcome to C Sharp. Press run again. We'll send that back to the cloud. Run that and execute it. So what we get there is now we are taking your code, let you explore the language, and you can run anything that you want inside this browser. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to download anything. It's all running interactively in the browser for you to experiment with. This first tutorial, or first quick start, we start with running a program. We'll teach you a little bit how to use different variables. One of the things that we do is, since we do run the compiler and we teach you about different structure of the C# language, if you make a mistake in typing something and you type something that's not valid C#, like in this section, I'm going to ask you to declare variables. And to make them work, one of the things C# has is you have to declare the type. So there I'm declaring that a friend is a string, which is a collection of characters. I give it a name, and then we ask you to go ahead and print it out. But if you happen to make a mistake, and maybe you forget to declare the type, and you press run, our output is going to give you an error that says something effective, the name a friend does not exist in the current context. So you tried to use a variable, a friend, but you didn't declare it. And our tip on these is that anytime you see this, this is the compiler telling you that something that you typed isn't something that the C# compiler understands. So you need to understand the grammar of the language, work with the grammar of the language, and get those to work a little bit more in tune with what you're trying to do, and understand how the compiler understands what you're typing, and work those through to get the syntax correct so that the compiler understands what you're trying to say. As you work through the quick starts, you can do them in order. Each one has a check mark that will keep track for you of what parts of the tutorial you've done, which parts still need to be done later. You can skip around though if you'd like. We also enable you, if you want, you can copy the code to try some things. Paste to bring the code back into the editor. Run different portions, see the output, and experiment on your own. So the first one, as I said, works with strings. If I go back up, our second tutorial teaches you more about different things in numbers in C#, where C# has a few different types of numbers. We start teaching you a little bit about integers, which are whole numbers that you know from math. Those whole numbers basically work to do any integer math. And one of the areas that we teach you about here is that when we're working with whole numbers, we start to do things like division. We will always get a whole number, even if the actual answer mathematically is not a whole number. Integer division rounds down. Just like math, you can put parentheses around any of the operations. You can combine multiple operations in one statement. And the order of operations matches the mathematical rules that you're probably familiar with, where multiplication and division take place before addition. We can explore those. A couple interesting things about any programming language is that, unlike math, where we say if you have numbers, they go on infinitely, either positively or negatively, one of the things that is important in a computer representation is that we have limits. There's only so large of a number that a machine can store. And any numeric in C# has a constant that tells you those limits. So you can see range of integers is negative to yada, 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 to positive to whatever, whatever, whatever. And one of the interesting properties of any programming language is that if you run beyond those limits, as I would do here by starting with that max value and adding more numbers to it, we'll get what's called overflow. So if you look at the overflow error, you can see that here I get, for an answer of adding 3 to max int, instead of mathematically max int plus 3, what you actually get is minimum int plus 2, because we overflowed and kind of wrapped around, sort of, you can think of a circle of all the possible integer numbers. So we kind of wrapped around them, and we get this very tiny number. That's what's called overflow or underflow. We can do that in either direction. If we want to work with much, much larger numbers, like in scientific applications, there's a type in C# called a double, which is a double precision floating point number. If you took mathematics up through some of the higher math in high school or college, you're familiar with scientific notation. Double works somewhat like that, but those notations are in binary. And double allows us to get that greater precision in terms of getting fractions and decimals. And one of the other things you can explore here is you'll end up being able to explore rounding error with a double type. Doubles will enable you to only have so much precision. Just like we learned in science class, when you measure certain things, there's always a little rounding error. And if you keep working with them, you end up with some smaller and smaller and accumulating errors. So we let you explore that just a little bit. And all the way along, anywhere in here, this is a live editor. You can explore and do whatever you want. Add more numbers, do more math, come up with other potential things to try. Everything is live and will work. The last one that we discuss here in this is fixed points, which is higher precision, but a little bit smaller range, often used in financial calculations. And the last one that we're going to look at in terms of our quick starts, we've got one about branches and loops. This is one of the key concepts in C# or any programming language. If you looked at all the steps that I wrote so far, they all execute one after the other. So you're going to do the first step, do the second step, do the third, and so on. Now once we see something like an if statement, what we're going to do is we get conditional execution, where what we're going to see is I'm going to make a test. You can see I'm testing if a plus b is greater than 10. And when that happens, I'm going to write out a message. Well, if I change the value of b and make it 3, and now when I run, you can see now I get no output. Okay, that's that branching logic. I've now put something together that says, okay, only if this thing is true, then execute the next statement. That's a very, very important concept in any and all programming. At different points in a program, you're going to make decisions based on conditions of variables that you're looking at, or of conditions in the outside world, what day it is, what day of the week it is, what time it is, weather reports, you may be checking other conditions, and what have you. If statements enable you to branch based on those conditions, and every if statement also contains an else clause. So we can then take one of two different branches depending on a condition. So by adding an else clause, now you see I get some output here. And in addition to working with if and else, we can do some things where we repeat operations. One of the key reasons we like programming and working with computers is because what we're going to do is we can do computations or perform operations very, very quickly. And we can perform them very repetitively without making mistakes or without making new and different mistakes. So here I'll add the code that we've given you as a starter. And we'll have to scroll down here a little bit to see this, but you can see I take this counter that starts at 0, and I say that give it a condition of while that counter is less than 10. I write a message. And then this last line is new. That's what's called an increment operator. So I add 1 to the value of the counter. And when I do that, well, now I loop back through up into that while statement. I check to see if the counter is less than 10. And then I walk through each one of those again. Another loop we have is something called a for loop. And we go through and describe that in detail on the tutorial. So overall, with these different quick starts, what we have, and there will be more coming here, you get to work on and experiment with C# in the browser, learn some of the syntax, hopefully learn some things about the language, and we want this to engage you so that you would like to learn more. And this is very low impact. Again, I said everything is in the browser. You don't need to download anything. You don't need to install anything. You don't need to do anything else other than open up a browser. I'll have the link to where the quick starts are at the very end of this deck. Experiment with yourself. Share it with friends, other people who are interested in learning programming or learning C#, and start to experiment with the language. Now, there's only so much that we let you run in the browser. There's only so many things in a program that are safe to run in a browser or that are fast enough to run in a browser. You know, some programs that we write do a lot more work, run for a lot longer, and we really don't want to do that just in a browser. So at some point, after you've played with these quick starts for a while, you're going to want to do a little bit more. So once we do that, let's start looking at C# and .NET Core as a very small, lightweight install. It's not that hard to bring into your computer. And then start writing C# on your local machine, and then execute that and run those programs anywhere you want, and work more with some of the other larger templates that you can see in other sessions, and start building what you really want to build. Because I think you want to get beyond just playing in a browser as you're programming and build the things that excite you. So let's show how you do that. If we go to the site .net, that's going to start to gear you toward downloading the right machine for you, the right things. And we're going to pick the .NET Core. And if we went to download it, I would be downloading the Mac OS version. I do already have it on this machine. You're going to need an editor. The one that I am going to use is something called Visual Studio Code, which is code.visualstudio.com. If you already have an editor you like, whether that's Sublime, Eclipse, Vim, what have you, everything I'm showing will work in that environment as well. I'm going to concentrate on this one just because it's the one that's on this machine. And it's more fun to write code and work with code than it is to watch me install things. So I'm going to switch over to a console. I've created a directory here, and I'm just going to make a couple subdirectories so we can play just a little bit with C# locally. And the command to create a new application with .NET Core is called .NET is the .NET CLI. That executes commands that do things that .NET does. And there's a command in .NET called .NET New, which will create a new application for you in the current directory. So it will give you some starter C# files. It will give you a .csproj file, which I'll explain as we get going, but that basically is a set of commands and configuration that helps build your application. You don't really need to look inside that file often, but it does have configuration about how we build the application using the .NET CLI. So if I type .NET New, I get a whole bunch of information out about the kinds of things .NET New will build for me. There's some job options at the beginning, and I'll let you explore those on your own and read those. The main thing I want you to see here is we can build a console application. We can build different kinds of unit test projects. As you start building more things, and as Kathleen was talking about, start building those unit test projects around the code that you're creating so that you test it and verify it. We can build a variety of different web applications, from an empty MVC MVC with Razor Pages, SPA, React, Web API. Some of the ones at the bottom you will learn about as you explore more about the .NET ecosystem. Those are different kinds of configuration files we use for larger projects. For introductory level things, everything once you get past ASP.NET Core Web API, you probably won't use for quite a while. But they are there as you grow in and learn more. If you look at the languages, I'm specifically talking about C# here today. There are a couple other languages in the .NET ecosystem, F# and Visual Basic. Different templates are supported there as well, so you can build some of those applications in those languages if you want to learn those as well. So since I created a console directory, let's start by exploring a little bit with the console locally. So I'm going to do .NET New, and I'm going to say it's a console application. We have a few lines that came out. So, template console application was created successfully. That made some assets on my machine. And then it says this post-creation actions. So it's running a command called .NET Restore. And what that does is if you look, you can see it saying restoring packages. So .NET Restore is grabbing NuGet packages or .NET assets, other assemblies that a console application relies on. By analogy, if you're familiar with NPM, you can think of it as the packages, an analog to NPM, but for .NET assemblies. Now, if we just list this, you can see we have that program.cs and a console.cs project file. So if I want to just see what got created, I'm going to do .NET Run. And it's going to do a build for me. And then, amazingly, it runs Hello World. That's a good place to start. Just like we started online, exploring in the browser. When we do this in your own machine, we're going to start with just a Hello World program. Let's go ahead and look at that program. So I switched over to Visual Studio Code. In Visual Studio Code, if I want to open something, I'm going to open an entire folder. And it learns just everything that's in that folder. So if I go to .NET Conf, go to my console application, open it up, it's going to start. This first error is something mostly on my machine because of some add-ins that I have. It's because I have not checked this in to get into source control. The second one is one that you're going to see when you load an application in Visual Studio Code on your machine. It says required assets to build and debug are missing from console. You want me to add them? We're going to say yes. If you watch the left side of my screen, we're going to see a new directory get created that's called .vs Code. Those are some things that the Visual Studio Code editor uses in order to build your application and configure some things to run it just inside the editor if you want, instead of switching over to the shell. So I open program.cs, and you can see this is a little bit more than what we saw in the browser. In the browser, you were running inside a sandbox that we created for you to run your code and bring it back. This shows you a little bit more structure of what's inside an application. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can look more at the code. So you see that in the middle, that console.write line for Hello World. That's what we actually created. That is the stuff that executes that you really care about, just like we did in the browser. When I look outside this, I'm going to see a few little things that are helpful as we start building larger programs. This is why when you switch over to build things on your machine rather than in the browser, you're going to start to see more of this syntax. The first one, the static void main, that's a method. It's a function. What that means is it is a block of code that we can reuse by calling it multiple times. In particular, for C#, main is a method for the entry point for an application. So some things that you don't see that are part of those packages that got restored by .NET Restore are going to call this method to start your program. Outside of it, you see where we have this class program. We can rename that particular class anything that we wanted, but everything inside C#, remember from that first slide, it's an object-oriented language, which means that everything that you create inside C# is code that exists inside a class or inside of some type. Class program is a type. So the type for my program, and it has a method in it. Namespaces are something that you can ignore as you start exploring until you start building larger and larger applications. A namespace is simply a way to organize different pieces of your application as it gets bigger. Think of it as like different file folders or different bins to put stuff in. Kathleen and Scott were talking about this application that had some data transfer objects, a front end, a back end, and so on. Different namespaces keep those organized. For a small program, you're probably only going to have one namespace. So then it just kind of sits there. And then at the very top, you see this using statement. Well, that's just something that says there is a namespace out there called system, which is where a lot of the core .NET framework types and APIs live. And in this program, I'm going to use that namespace, and I'm going to use types from that namespace. In fact, this console.writeLine, if you look when I roll over it with the cursor, it gives me some information about it. That is a class system.console. So it's part of that system namespace. So by saying using system, I'm saying I'm going to use stuff that's in here. Now, over on the way left, you can see a few tabs here. One of them is this debugger tab. That helps us look at an application and watch it run slowly. I'm going to switch this over so I can see this side a little bit quicker. There's two different ways I can launch it. I can either attach to a running application, or I can launch it inside a console that will start in this bottom right part of the editor. Now I'm going to add just a couple more lines here. We'll go back to that very beginning sample that we did inside the browser. We'll say, welcome to C#. And that we're writing some code on our machine. Okay, so now I've got 3 lines. If I go up and I just press this green button to start debugging the application, we can see now we create this window in the lower right hand of our screen. We're starting to run some things. Did a build, and you can see that we looked at and printed out those 3 messages. So it works pretty much like what we did in the browser. Now we're just seeing more of these things locally. I'm going to slide this over a little bit, and we're going to show you some tools so you can really explore the language and watch how execution happens. I'm going to press over in the left-hand side here. You can see as I start to move my cursor around, you can see I get this little red dot. If I press that, that red dot gets bright. That's what's called a breakpoint. Now what that means is when I start this application, the application starts to run. Visual Studio Code is watching how the application runs. And when it gets to that breakpoint, right there at line 8 where that red circle is, execution is going to stop. It's going to move from my application running, and it's going to stop inside Visual Studio Code and show me exactly where my application is. We'll get to these variables a little bit on the left in a second, but right now I'm just going to hit that green button again. It's going to do a build. It's going to start, loading some symbols, and now you see that little yellow mark over by where that red circle is. If you look in this output window, there's no information at all in that output or debug console. Up at the top, I've got buttons that help me control the execution of my application. The second one here steps over to the next line. So if I press that, you can see that yellow arrow moves to the first line of the program, the first console.writeLine. I'm going to press it one more time. And now if you look in that debug console, you can see hello world was printed. My program is executing one step at a time under my control. And it stopped, waiting for me to do the next thing. I press it again. It says welcome to C#. Press it one more time, writing code locally. Press it again, and we're all done. We've hit the end of that method, that main method, and our program has stopped executing. So this is a neat way just to explore what a program can do. I'm going to slide over here back to where we were looking at with our quick starts. And let's now look at that branches and loops sample, because that's where we start to get some interesting things that could happen. I'm going to copy this first one where we have that if and else. And let's put that inside our main method here. And for people first learning to program C#, I encourage you to try something like this once you get far enough that you've installed your favorite editor, whatever it happens to be. One thing, I'm cleaning this up mostly just for our readability purposes. C# doesn't really care about indent levels. It's not significant. But it's a little bit easier for us as humans to read. So now inside main, you can see I've got a few other bits of code in there. I'm going to assign those variables, declare an int, assign it to 5, declare another int, assign it to 3, make a test, and then print something. I've still got that same breakpoint in line 8. So I'm going to press the green button to start it. And what you're going to see is this blue 1 is telling me that I've got one file that's not saved. When I press the start debugging, it's automatically going to save that file. It's going to do a build to recreate the executable with the new code I've just written. Then it will start the program. We'll get to that red circle, and then it'll stop. And it'll ask me what I want to do in the debugger. We'll get to really explore a little bit of how C# executes. So here we are, we started. Great, we're stopped, nothing's happened. Now if you look over here, I've got some interesting stuff. I can now look at some local variables. Here's some interesting things to see. A and B, which they say are integers, well, their value is 0. We haven't set them yet because we haven't gotten that far in the program. Okay, so I can now step over it. I'm now onto the line that's going to assign A. So as I press that same button, watch over in the locals. You see that sort of flash there, and now A is assigned the value of 5. We've executed that line. We've initialized that variable. Press it again. We've now initialized B. Now we're at that if statement. We're going to evaluate that A plus B, which would be 8, and then see if that's greater than 10. So we step over it, and notice a couple different things. So we evaluated that A plus B, and then we jumped over the first console.write line, because the answer wasn't greater than 10, and we're on the second one. So I'm just going to hit the green button to say go, and just run the rest of the program. That's how if statements work in practice. It just changes where execution is. We'll go back to our initial value. Let's press the green button again. As we keep exploring, we're going to do things a little bit quicker and just step over the first few lines. All right, now we're up to try to figure out A plus B, is it greater than 10? Should be 12. And now see, we get to that first line. Well, I'm not going to just press the green chevron here because I want to see what happens next. So I pressed the step over, and you can see it printed out the message. Great, the answer is greater than 10. And then it leaped over the else clause because since A plus B was greater than 10, it executes the things under the if clause, not the things under the else clause. Great way to just explore and learn the language. Okay, so what we've done so far, we've played a little bit with C# in a browser, so we can try small little snippets. We can work with things inside a browser, write some C#, learn some of the syntax, learn some of the basic structure. Go ahead, bring down and install .NET Core. You'll notice I'm working on a Mac here. .NET Core works on Mac, Windows, and several Linux distributions. Explore using your favorite editor. I happen to pick VS Code. If you like Sublime or Eclipse or whatever, those will work as well. Play with it, explore the language, have some fun, and see where you can go next. So a lot of different ways to explore. Do we have any questions? I'm hoping as people get started working through some of this and trying to figure out where this is going. But we can add anything, and as you get going further and further, what I would encourage is you want to learn the language is any of the tutorials that you work through online, if you want to really see exactly how different parts work, you can copy them into one of your local environment and run it there. So I'm going to pick one of the slightly longer, later ones, where one of the last things that we do is we work on combining loops and branches to try to put different parts of a tutorial together. So we'll try to write that last one. So what we want to do is let's try to find the sum of all the integers 1 through 20 that are divisible by 3. So if I could do this online if I wanted. And a few hints are that that modulo operator, which is part of this tutorial, shows you the remainder. If gives you a condition. And a for loop can help us repeat some steps through 1 through 20. All right, so if I'm going to go for some int I, and we're going to start it at 1. I is less than 20. And then we're going to increment I. And then inside that for loop, I want to see, is this number divisible by 3? Well, if I, and we use that modulo operator 3, if that is equal to 0, that's going to mean it's divisible by 3. And then I'm going to need to do something to say, oh, I want to add something to a sum. So let's go up above line 1. This is a true editor. I can do anything, insert lines anywhere I want. And we're going to start the sum at 0. And here I'm going to then say sum equals sum plus I. And then when I'm done doing all of this, I'm going to just say console.writeLine sum. And we'll run. And then as we get the number back, we see 63. Okay. I would hope that's right. I think I may have gotten that right correctly. But let's work through it in some of the richer tools that we have and do it locally. So I'm going to copy that same code. We'll put it here inside Visual Studio Code. I'm going to format this again just because I really want you to be able to see some things in a nice way. And then let's just set a breakpoint here, and I'm going to want to watch as we go through some things and see, do I get the right answer? So this is how I would go about debugging something like this if I'm just experimenting. So we'll hit the green button to debug. And we start, and we're learning the language. We're trying to figure out how things work. Okay, sum starts at 0. That's good. I'm going to start through. All right, I've initialized sum. Awesome. Now I'm seeing I. It shows up. It's now in scope. Okay, I'm going to increment I. It starts at 1. And I'm going to run this test to see if 1 is divisible by 3. Okay, should get the wrong answer there. It should leap forward and then go back into my for loop. Awesome. We're incrementing I. You can see it's kind of highlighted there with that I++. All right, I is still less than 20 because if you look on the left, it's 2. I walk down. Okay, we're going to check to see if I is divisible by 3. Nope, it's not. All right. Okay, so that logic looks like it's working. Let's just check it when it gets to 3. Okay, so now I'm checking to see if 3 is divisible by 3. Should be. 3 divided by 3 is 1. That if statement was true. So we're going to go look at sum and see that sum is sum plus I. So sum should now take on the value 3. Okay, it did. Great. Now instead of just walking every single one of these, I just now kind of want to check to see if I always get the right stuff. So I'm just going to set a breakpoint on the line that executes sum. And by doing that, I can then hit that green button to say just go until you hit a breakpoint, and it will only stop on those numbers that are divisible by 3. So I'll hit go, and now if I look, okay, int I, that's 6. That would be the next number divisible by 3. Great. I'm going to just step over it. Yep, 3 plus 6 is 9. Sum got updated correctly. I'll hit go. Okay, I is now 9. We're walking through this step by step. Okay, 9 and 9 is 18. Okay, I'm starting to feel like I pretty much got this algorithm correct. Nice way to explore. And when I think I really got it, I can remove the breakpoint. We finished running in 63. Okay, so we got that correct. So let's look at the different things that we've learned today. We can run in the browser. We're super thrilled to announce this. This is in preview mode, so you can experiment with these tutorials. If we go back up to the quick starts, we're going to see that there are 3 there right now. We're going to continue to write more of these tutorials so that you can continue to explore the language interactively before downloading Visual Studio Code or before working with anything inside your machine. As you start getting more interested, head over to Visual Studio Code, install the .NET Core SDK, start working on your own, and explore and build more of what you want to build. With that, we've switched back. Here are some of the resources that we have. If you want to look at things that are in the browser, those quick starts, aka.ms, C#-quick starts, those are going to be the ones that we have interactive. There are 3 now. It's in preview mode. Try them out. Tell friends that are interested in programming, try it out and experiment. The C# tutorials, which I'll show you in the browser here. Also under the C# guide, we have a whole set of tutorials. These are things that you can build on your machine. They're roughly in order of things that will be fairly simple to get fairly more complicated. And we're going to continue to add more here for more different ways to experiment and learn about the C# language. .NET Core, if you go to aka.ms, .NET Core/get started or -get started. Another section of our docs under .NET Core, Get Started, has any number of walkthroughs that will help walk you through building your first application, whether you're using Visual Studio Code, whether you want to do something in Visual Studio on the Mac or on the PC. If you prefer using Visual Basic as a language, there are tutorials there as well. .NET Core SDK, Microsoft.com/net/core, that's where you get it. Visual Studio Code at code.visualstudio.com. How do I get back to a console output session is one of the questions that I've had. I think I know what you want to start with there. If I understood the question correctly, my output session here will stay in the debug console and I can continue to look at it. Another thing that you can do is with anything that you've built, if you do .NET Run, it will run in that console. You can continue to look at what's there. I think that answers your question. If it doesn't, please add more and I'll try to drill down into where you were looking at. Another great question is, are there any good sites that help with providing simple projects a beginner can build? We're definitely investing in a number of them. Code Academy has some. I will add some more links later because I don't have all of them off the top of my head. I'm trying to think if there are any others that I remember right now. I don't. I would have to look further, and I will add some things in the comments after this session. So if you're watching this online after it's been recorded, look down there and you'll see links. And I will try to update it with other resources where you can learn C#. There is a Learn C# site that I haven't investigated a lot, but has a number of tutorials in it. And then code.visualstudio.com brings that down. Different things that I want you to try next to learn more. Run the interactive quick starts. Those are going to give you a good feel for a start of the language. Try .NET Core and try Visual Studio Code, or try your favorite editor. Visit the C# guide to learn more. Go to docs.com or docs.microsoft.com/.net/C#. That is the home of the C# guide. Everything we have about C#, which is constantly being updated, is published there. And tell us what you think. As I said, this interactive browser experience is new. We're launching it today. As you explore, if you find issues, and I'm sure that there are probably some out there, preview mode, go to .NET or github.com/.net/docs/issues. Tag it with area C# quick starts. That's one of the labels that we have. I will show you that. If we go to from any of our pages, we should be able to get to our home site. If I go to edit, that's going to take me to the source on GitHub. If we go under issues, if you were to create a new issue, if you look at the labels, we have labels for any of the areas. And C# Quick Starts would be anything for the interactive. Another one, if there are tutorials that you want us to write that would help you learn different things or areas you find challenging, create an issue and let us know. Scott and Kathleen both said, these are open source docs. We really want to listen to your feedback and provide the guidance that you need to create great F# or C# content. Help us out by writing issues on things that you want to see. If you've got ideas, if you're one of the more advanced people that are watching this, if you have ideas of tutorials that you want to write us an issue and give us an outline of what you would want to do and work with us to get us a pull request, and we would be very happy to see those as well. Any other questions that are coming in? No. And with that, I think we will take a short break, and we'll be back with a second session for people who have already worked with C# and are ready to explore what's new in the language.